At the same time, I'm of course immensely glad, happy, honored, pleased to give the floor to Irina Prokhorova, the editor-in-chief of Новое литературное обозрение, the new literary observer, by far the major, most important publisher of Russian literature and scholarly works in the ever since the Soviet Union fell. And I think it is only logical for us to end our two-day conference on publishing Russian literature in the Cold War with a perspective, with a perspective of someone who has come to pretty much succeed this phenomenon that we've been discussing. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Irina Dmitrievna to Hamburg. Welcome back, totally, and to New York as always. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, of course that's the end of the second day. Everyone is tired, and of course this is, I would say, a strange situation when I have tried to conceptualize the topics which have been discussed for 2 days. I hope my talk will not too long. Anyway, first of all, of course, I want to thank Yasha, Klots and organizers of this conference, which is of tremendous importance to me. This topic of Tamizdat, Samizdat, dissident movement, right activists, anything in a way, it's almost, I would say, personal issue for me. I'll just, before trying to explain how I see the whole problem of Tam and Samizdats in a way, just a few remarks, I would say, of my biography. Just for quite a long time, just all these stories about dissidents, underground world, somehow did not exist for me. I just was an ordinary Soviet citizen. My parents were IT intellectuals, so to say, intelligentsia, somehow quite loyal. So I grew up in this ignorant bliss, didn't know anything. So I was evicted from this paradise when I entered the university. So that's why I think that all authoritarian regimes are very keen not to educate people. So that spoiled my whole optimistic worldview, because of course at that moment I started reading Tamizdat, Samizdat. I learned quite a lot about your rights activists who are called dissidents, though I have never been acquainted to them until the 1990s. But after all this, when I realized that an absolutely different world exists, which I was ignorant of, I thought it was my moral imperative, to use Immanuel Kant's expression, to study this really underground world, and somehow to think about this phenomenon. And when I launched my journal and the publishing house in 1992, from the very first issue of New Literary Observer, I started publishing the former underground poets, writers, prose writers in a way. And it was almost a scandal, because in a way I considered that this is a new mainstream that we should search and produce to the public. And quite a lot of literary critics of the early 90s were flabbergasted and confused, because somehow it was looked as it was an ignoring all these traditions of the late Soviet literature, which was quite good in a way. And for many years, I tried to publish memoirs, correspondence, many other, all genres dealing with underground world and dissident movement in the publishing. And I can't help boasting that next year we'll publish 2 volumes of so-called the Dictionary of Dissidents, which is prepared by Memorial and Polish Carta. And I think that's quite an important thing. For the first time, we could see almost all people who are involved in not dissident, but right activist movements, so to say. But all these years, I was wondered why people don't study, I would say, non-censored or I would say underground, any term would do. Probably that's the people of the ground world usually spoke of themselves as the second avant-garde. If we need some positive definition in a way. Why this strange nostalgia of studying so-called socialist realism, that was a discussion yesterday, or this big style of the Stalinist style. In a way, strangely enough, I think that was kind of phantoms, the false path. Speaking, and if you deal with all these notions, especially socialist realism in a way, you don't understand anything was really going on. So the problem is how we can define all these situations, censored literature, non-censored literature, how they intertwined. Are there different worlds, or somehow there are bridges, or it's one literature somehow. You know, it's an interesting moment because at the late 1980s, during the perestroika, when the first publication of Former Forbidden Writers appeared, so there was a huge discussion in the late Soviet press how we should look at Russian literature. Now, when we can read all waves of emigre writers, some of the writers were coming from Tamizdat and Samizdat and many other things. Whether there's one literature, or there are different literatures. So the question was posed, but unfortunately, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, so this problem just disappeared. People stopped speaking about it. And I think this was quite a mistake, because nowadays we can see this conservative turn. It appears we're still staying with the Soviet history of literature, because the main protagonists are the same, and some forbidden writers are included in this canon, but still there is no revision of it. I think that's really a problem, and I'm so grateful that this topic is now just being discussed for these 2 days. And really, how we can look at this Tam and Samizdat, it's a non-censored literature. Is it really opposed to a censored one or not? How we should divide it on ethical terms, aesthetical terms, it's a problem. That's the question which just started, how we can define Tam and Samizdat literature. I think we should look at it from the broader perspective. For instance, in the context of this development of the book market, starting from the 70s and the 18th century. By the way, quite recently we've published a wonderful book by Robert Dunton, who is historical anthropologist and also the historian of books. And the book is called The Censors at Work. So he studied 3 cases: pre-revolutionary France, the colonial India, and the GDR censorship. So he compared different types of censorship that occurred at different historical times in different cultures. And interesting enough, he showed that with this development of secular culture, that's quite a lot of books, of course, has been censored and banned. So that's one of his most interesting stories, how this famous encyclopedia by the French Enlighteners, it was banned in France for many years. So they had to publish it in Switzerland, in Holland, and many other countries, and then the books were smuggled into France. So he showed different ways, and his idea, the main goal of the book, as I can understand it, that studying the history of forbidden books and censorship, we can learn quite a lot about the society. So this aspiration of the development of society, the changes within the society, and these clashes between I would say, the ruling classes, speaking Marxist, in a way, and this dynamic development of modern society in a way. In this case, I would say, speaking in Samizdat, in the Western Europe, in the Eastern Europe, generally, including Russia in a way, I think this is the best way to see how these societies rather rapidly change after the World War II. And the books that were banned, yes, of course, that were political books, different kinds of literature, but also pornography, all kinds of mysticism, which is also in Samizdat. It were quite important because all these topics were tabooed. So everything what was to sex, and politics and many other things, we had to read through this type of literature. So interesting enough, if you look at all this literature, this is a huge ocean of books and topics which existed in this semi-legal sphere. So in a way, I don't know whether we should create some special definition of Tam and Samizdat, but probably to see that's a kind of free press that existed in different societies at different times. And I think it's an exciting thing to see how it's changed society from within. The second very important issue, that's really how all this Sam and Tamizdat was organized from the point of view of industry. And we touched this topic today especially, and I think it's wonderful because it was a parallel industry, parallel world, with a system of distribution, with its own literary canons, with its ethics, and many other things. And if we look now of this proliferation of this all small groups of people, all these Moscow kitchens, these semi-legal publishers in Poland, and many other things, in a way, now we can see that all these things have anticipated the internet era. So that's really, that created this flexible type of society, this horizontal ties. So in a way, they were very innovative, not only in bringing new ideas, but different type of connecting people. And strangely enough, these innovations come in the country which were oppressed by very rigid political regimes. So strangely enough, it came from both, even in the Western country, it came from the so-called technical innovations. From the East European countries, it came from political situation. But strangely enough, this direction was quite innovative and interesting. Now we can see that, studying this, the history of Samizdat, it is to see again what's a different way, different path to, I would say, democratic world. But of course, we need to respect all these notions which appeared in the old times. It could be ironical. Of course, it's to the older generation that Tam and Samizdat always sounds very ironical. And in a way, that was an attempt for people really to get published. I never believe, as a publisher, in all these talks that we didn't want to get published. And it was a kind of consolation because people realized that in the beginning of the 80s especially, when my generation was totally disillusioned in the Soviet regime and our perspectives, we didn't want to become members of Communist Party to make careers. So what consolation we had? Yes, to write and read something for a small group of people, pretending that we liked it. But with the beginning with independent publishers, we could see that all these people immediately got their manuscripts and published them in the new free press. So I think that was a great thing. Otherwise, the whole generation was doomed, to live in this without any self-realization. But talking about all this definition, Tam and Samizdat, whether it's a useful thing if we want to write the other history of literature? In a way, I'm not sure. I don't know the answer, but I think it's high time to find new instruments, new approaches to talk about what happened, let's say, to Russian literature of the 20th century. what were the main literary trends, whether really we can say about one big Russian literature or different Russian literatures. Interesting enough, we had a kind of interesting experiment. It was not a new literary observer, but I am also a co-founder of charity foundation, which is called Karl Popper Foundation. So in 2009, I initiated a literary prize, which is called NOS, Новая словесность, New Prose. And so that's the uniqueness of this prize, that the shortlists and the laureates are chosen in open debates. So the critics, the member of jurors, have to talk to the audience and produce their arguments. So it's a wonderful literary game. And it's very useful because it shows that we have the so-called the crisis of critical perspective and critical issue, because it's now difficult to say why this book is bad or good, because all this aesthetical system, I would say, all these criteria which were used in the former time in the Soviet Union don't work anymore. So, but we can't judge it properly because we don't have this larger picture, new picture of the development of Russian literature. So, within the frames of this literary prize, we just organized a number of sort of special projects. And one of the projects was in 2011. We said, let's imagine that we had such an independent prize in 1973. What type of literature would be nominated from our point of view to this long shortlist, and who will be the winner? Why we've chosen 1973? Of course, the idea was the beginning of the 70s, because that was the generation gap between modernist, late modernist, and the emergence of postmodernism in many countries. And I would say the idea was that we'll have a look what was going on, not only in Samizdat or Tamizdat, but also in official publishing. So we searched, all the books, at least we tried to do it, that were published in all kinds of ways, or even something that were finished but never published at that moment. And I'll show you what we managed to produce. Can you see it all? No, I'm not sure. No. Unfortunately, it's. No. Smaller. Just make it smaller. That's. It's. Well, I'll try. A little bit. Is it touch screen? No, sorry.
Bottom right corner.
Yeah, go to the bottom right corner.
Yeah.
Good.
Right there. Oh, well, but it's not.
Like this.
Not. Okay, I'll try to. That's Alexander. Can you see it?
Yes.
It produced a great effect on the Russian audience, because what we managed, that was it's totally it's a different picture of creative writing in the beginning of the 70s. Of course, we could, some of the books were not included because we didn't know. Say, for instance, Lydia Ginsburg, probably she had finished part of her work, so she could be included. Andrei Bitin with his Pushkin House. As far as I remember, it was written in 1971, but published only in 78. But we decided it's okay. It's 1973 at least. And you can see it has nothing to do with traditional view on Russian literature. And when we put this this list of authors into internet before starting, discussing the things. So many people wrote, oh really, we had a great literature, but not the image of it is absolutely different. I think probably this is a more or less fruitful approach to start writing this different history of Russian literature. Because I can only see this is a huge interrelationship between different parts of this writing. So Tamizdat, Samizdat, official publishing, non-official publishing, it doesn't matter in a way. But interesting enough, you can see, yeah, probably there are some other books that could be commended, but in a way it's truly interesting combination of writers that appeared in the early 70s.
Where is poetry? Or it's
No, we took only prose because otherwise, in a way, we can play it further. Of course, it could be poetry here, there's something else in a way. But, this horizontal view, without prejudice, showed us that how many interesting different genres and styles appeared at that time. So were they competing or complementary to each other? What we can think about it in a way. And the question with this study, how we can deal, for instance, comparing different waves of emigre literature with the Soviet one, or between themselves. Whether this emigre literature of different ways, what type of innovative, was it innovative or not? What about the Soviet experiments and how, so there's so many questions that we can now pose if we try to look at this, as an entity. And the other experiment that we did the year later in 2012 just was a special project dealing with Russian non-fiction. That meant diaries, correspondence, all kinds of reminiscences in a way. And our idea was that probably the best real fiction in the 20th century was written in the genre of non-fiction. And it can tell you much more about the country, the time, the people, and the society. That's many books that have been highly censored or were totally unknown to the broader public, in a way. And so I can show you another list which we created. And by the way, yes, I have forgotten to say that it was a huge discussion who will be the winner. Can you roll it down? So, because we have this.
Yeah.
Yes. So there was a huge debate. So the jury, it was at Nersinyavsky. So they say that was the best, most innovative things. But the experts, we invited a number of literary critics who opposed the jury. So they thought that's Benedict Eurofeev, Moskva division. But the audience that were listening and participating in the debate, they vote, they had the special votes, so they chose Varlam Shalom. But also we had this readers' internet votes, and so they chose Vasily Skandal. So it's interesting what different types of people read at that time. And in a way, it's always that reader's reception. I think it's quite an interesting topic in itself. So, but as far as this non-fiction as fiction is concerned, so we had another list, which is even larger than that. I'm afraid it will be difficult to have a look at. It's quite big. Is it all? I'm not sure. Almost. I don't know. I'm not sure. Is it the last one or not? No, not all. Oh. There are 40, but you can see that's a curious combination of absolutely different types of non-fiction prose, I would say. Sorry for this strange combination. And it also creates a very interesting view on the Soviet creativity, I would say. Yes, so I would invite you probably to follow all our examples and to create all these different criteria for combining different sorts of writing, so to understand, to get rid of the stereotypes, about the socialist realism, not socialist realism, magical realism, modernism, postmodernism, in a way that we need all these redefinitions.
Yeah, it's amazing.
You see, you're amazed a little bit. Yes, we were amazed ourselves, when we just produced this list.
Like Polina was quite recent, and this is, you are talking about which years? This is also
That's the Soviet period, and even the early post-Soviet. We wanted to choose the best non-fiction. I mean, dealing with this, direct speech, diaries, so nowadays, which is considered to be a real new types of fiction, which is true in many ways. But it creates such a range of opinions, worldview, in a way, that I think that's a good starting point to think about this new, the other literature.
Who won?
Okay.
Can you go down so we can see
Yeah,
the
I don't remember who it was.
Go down.
Yeah, could you have a look? I don't remember whether I put it. Really, I have forgotten. But you can get to this Michael Prokhorov Foundation and see NOS, and then in the archive you can see it there. Yes, but it was more important to produce this list than, talking about, who will win in it.
Это же non-fiction.
No, it's not a prose, but I would say that's a reflection of intellectual reflection of the Soviet drama, I would say, by people, many of whom also wrote quite a lot of good prose. But we were interested whether we can think about the history of Russian literature of the 20th century, and memoirs and non-fiction is a very important trend. Probably it was mainstream in a way, if we speak about quality, aesthetic things, and many others. In such a way, of course, that was a kind of experiment, and you could do it from other different angles and recombine these. But it's a kind of liberation, because otherwise we always start speaking about what can be included in the so-called socialist realism or not. In a way, because it's no such a real phenomenon in socialist realism, but that was part of these ideological games and repressing the independent thought. So you can't find any logics why certain works were announced being a kind of model for socialist realism or not. For instance, why the work by Sholokhov and Quiet Flows the Dawn is considered as appetizing that the socialist realism. It has nothing to do with socialist criteria. There is no hero, heroic statue. It's drama. It's and on the one hand, it was as a kind of example. Everyone read it at school. On the other hand, if you look at Dr. Zhivago, it's also the same story. But the hero is from a little bit different social strata, but the same. This is the same tragedy. And why it was so fiercely criticized, no logic. Because it could personal whims, vendettas, different constellation of ideological struggle, and many other things in a way. So it's useless to redefine socialist realism and trying to talk in these terms. So my question, and I know still the answer, is that reading That's quite a lot of different type of literature in Tam and Samizdat. Of course, not pornography, that's a special field, very entertaining field. But of these great works, they were published abroad or somehow in the Samizdat version. They somehow must be and should be, analyzed through the lens of time, genre, and many other approaches. So in this way, I think, we'll manage to write this new history of Russian literature, not only the 20th century, probably we then could revise the 19th century as well. Without that, again, we're always in this booby trap, because we have to follow the lines and the steps of these old ideological cliches. And we will argue till the end of the world about all these types of realisms, not realisms, and all this in a way. So, in a way, Tamizdat and Samizdat as a notion is a very important historical thing. But I would say, I would probably taboo these words if we want to write this true history of the Russian literature. May I stop here and probably ask some questions?
Очень интересно. Я хотел сделать замечание совершенно... I will say in English, sorry.
Now we can speak it in Russian because everyone's so tired. We understand all languages simultaneously.
I don't know how many people. I want to say completely not related to any of the books. Just one thing which I noticed, and I think it has to be corrected in general, not by your publication, but by all. When I'm trying to defend Tamizdat publishers.
No, I'm not accusing Tamizdat publishers. I respect them. I'm saying about the criteria, whether you can use this.
You don't know what I want to say. I want to say that when you publish that list, this list or the previous list, and it's done also in many publishers in Russia today, they mention a lot of publications which are like they publish first time, and they don't mention when it was published first time abroad. And I think it's very important to mention, because Kruтой Marshut was published abroad in different times. Другие берега, most of the books were published in different, give mention of the first publication and mention the publisher. I think they deserve it.
Yes, absolutely. And in a way, if we look at this list and the previous one, we can see how many really great works were published in Tam and Samizdat. And in a way, in practice, they created the new canon, literary canon, new literary canon, which we should study and say how it changed the vision. So I'm the last person to undermine the importance of this great deed, and so that's the whole world of publishing. But I say we should try to find new approaches to deal with this great range of literature, very interesting, very different, very various in aesthetic and genres in a way. But how to do it? This is the question. We don't still have instruments enough, to deal with this huge pile of works, and we can enumerate them and admire each of them. But we should create this new constellation of authors to understand what's really in what we succeed in the spiderweb, what the trend has never developed because of the impossibility to get published freely. There were no public discussions about these works. So in many ways, it's a great drama, but still. That's the secret of human creativity.
I'd like to say that at the end of the earlier sessions of the round table today, the thing that I left with in my mind that I couldn't really decide was, were we discussing a sociological problem or a literary problem? Well, I think we discussed more sociology than we did literature. What this does is brings the spotlight back onto literary merit of the works being published, whether in Samizdat, Tamizdat, or by official publishers. But so I would extend what Pavel said to say at some point, particularly in view of today's discussion, would there be a way of actually also putting in brackets Samizdat only or Tamizdat or official, so that we could also see what this is introduced, what Tamizdat is introduced from the literary perspective, not just in terms of how it was done, what all the mechanisms were, or even which we discussed, the appearance of the books that came out, but what was their literary merit, which strikes me as the answer to another question that was raised: what is the question? And if the question is literature, this takes us a long way, I think.
But, you know, when we started this so-called experiment, we were not focused especially to, but you're right, it will be great to put down, you know, where it was published for the first time. It will create an even more impressive picture in a way. But our idea was simply, you know, let's create this new ways how to talk about literature. Of course, the majority of all these books have been published, either Tom or some, in some way. Or some of the books, for instance, Shaporina, which, by the way, my publisher has published. So the manuscript was found just several years ago only. It was just manuscript somewhere, elaborate, I don't remember, or some family archives in a way. So interesting enough, we still don't know quite a lot of things, and probably there are quite a lot of revelations and finding new wonderful books which people are still keeping somewhere in the attics and don't know where. But from this point of view, you could look and really say we had great literature of the 20th century in spite of all this cruel censorship and all sufferings, and that's the most amazing results which we received. We never expected ourselves, you know, because you can talk about many things, but when you put all the things together, you say, oh my God, how could it be under such circumstances? Yes, please.
Irina Dmitrievna, I want to introduce an alien note to this list making. As a major publisher of a number of these works, at Artists, I want to say to you what Karl Popper said at Olga Matic's very famous Third Wave conference. He gave a speech called One Literature or Two, and it was about emigre versus Soviet. And his conclusion, and it's the same problem, there is no emigre, there is no Soviet, there is one literature. Gogol wrote Dead Souls in Rome. Isn't Herzen part of literature? Herzen's books came in from abroad too. Because when you're talking about a writer, you're not talking about his geographical location or writing or publishing or anything else. You're talking about all the books he's read and the consciousness he carries of his culture. And having known Vladimir Nabokov, I can tell you he remained Russian in America, in Switzerland, and he's part of Russian literature. It's unusual, he's also part of American literature, but that's exceptional. I don't think that these need to be attributed to Tamizdat or Samizdat. I think that's to miss your very good point. It's time to integrate the history of Russian literature. That's my point. Thank you.
Yes, I quite agree with you. And on the one hand, we have this social and political history of, I would say, non-censored activity. And so Samizdat, and we must write the history as well, and you know, distribute the information as much as we can, disseminate this information, because still this is a knowledge of very few people, especially in Russia nowadays. But on the other hand, really, well, of course it's one literature, and the question is, by the way, we wanted to make this special project. I don't know we'll be able to do it. There quite a lot of other work. But how we can deal with this Soviet literature from the point of view of post-colonial studies. by the way, because usually we never think about it. What is Vasil Iskander? From the point of view of different cultural backgrounds and how he was translated into Russian or started writing into Russian. All those writers who wrote in their native languages, but Russian language became a kind of lingua franca, and they were involved in all this culture. What part of literature they are? Can we understand Russian literature and Soviet literature? There are all these different stories. Because should we exclude these writers because they started writing in different language and what we read are translations or not? There are so many questions that are not answered. Well, in a way, it's one literature because it's produced by the people, coming from the big country, multinational. On the other way, yes, but what are trends within this one literature? Can we say that Russian modernism exists as a huge trend as it was in the Western Europe or not? Because interesting enough that many writers after the World War II who belonged to so-called underground world, they tried to restore this tradition. And quite a lot of writings that till now in Russian, which somehow it's very difficult to read now. But still it's continuing this tradition which appeared too late, I would say, and was broken just in the 20s and the early 30s. Where you can say that we skipped modernism is a trend or not. Do we have some other trends in a way? Where can we speak about the succession of certain motives, genres or aesthetical things or not? Is it, what type of tradition it is? And it's always questions.
Just
Yeah.
very quickly to what you were saying, one of the results of the belatedness of Russian literary development is that, for instance, in the case of realism, there was Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, which a European realist didn't have. Because of the belatedness, there was another kind of additional development that characterized Russian literature. But I originally wanted to say, this is a quick response to what you were saying. An interesting detail, I think, Michael, you referenced Gleb Struve today, right?
No.
Gleb Petrovich Struve?
So it was
Who did?
another speaker.
Robin, you talked, sorry, Robin. Anyway, Gleb Struve wrote two important books, right? So his study of Soviet literature and of emigre literature. What is interesting is that his book on Soviet literature was published in English. He wrote it in English. He was bilingual, definitely. The emigre literature book is in Russian. Yeah, I think this says something, because of course he had a good cultural sense of the position of Russians in the middle of the 20th century abroad, right? So just, I find that curious. I just wanted to mention this curiosity. This is in part in response to Ellen Dea's comment about
speaking about modernism, this is a long talk. But I would say I've published quite a lot of writers from this Leonozov school, Moscow conceptualist school, and now have 5 volumes of Prigov writing in a way. Interesting enough, if you look at their works, comparing to, say, the American post-war artists, you can compare them freely. Interesting enough, that was not belatedness in this way, because they experimented with the same object. I mean, but if you speak about American conceptualists, they were playing with consumer society, with ready-made objects. The Soviet conceptualists were playing with ideological trash. So this is a real difference. But they worked side by side, and It's easier to compare and to say that was a really interesting, very influential direction of development. But what about the other?
But I was
things?
talking about earlier periods,
Yeah.
realism and modernism. Yeah? Andre Bailey's Petersburg was much more radical than
Yes, of course. Yes, of course.
Than even Proust's In Search of Lost Time, or certainly than Kafka. James Joyce different, but equal, yeah? So that's what I meant, that because it came late, modernism in Russia came late, 20 years later than in Europe, in France.
Yes,
There
but then it
things-
was, you know...
So it developed something on its own, it took another step. Because, of course, the Russian modernists were at that time quite familiar with European modernism. Because that's all different from the Soviet period. That I was referring to modernism, not to.
But this is also a question that many writers, especially before the war and after the war, working in the sense of an isolation. So they managed to read some works, but it was a systemic reading. So it's interesting what they managed to guess, whether they really invented something original just before they somehow misinterpreted, a productive misinterpretation of many things in a way. Still, there are quite a lot of questions, but again, we need these new tools of appreciating these things in a way, of comparing, of searching, of studying in a way. And that's the main question: what are these tools? How we can invent them? To say.
Yasha wants
If I may, I'll try to be. I have a question, but also, Olga, let us not forget that Struve wrote his Soviet literature book in the 30s and his emigre book in 56. So, which was way before your conference, before the conference you organized, where the question... I mean, it changes historically, so they do merge. If I may just ask a very quick question, what year was this list compiled? 12.
This one, I mean, it was 2011, and non-fiction is 2012.
So, as it is...
You can find it on the internet,
It is
New
quite...
technologies help,
It is quite inevitable when we see lists of 40 or 12, it is inevitable to be asking ourselves to what extent do these lists shape or contribute or reformulate the canon. And we have a very recent online project of Polka, right? I think it's 101 works, not authors, but texts like here, chosen by a representative group of experts. My question is, to what extent and in what ways do you think Tamizdat contributed over time to the formation of late 20th century Russian literary canon? By delivering those books to the readers, regardless of the geography, when at a time that...
Well, of course, it's contributed immensely. As I said, in a way, it's created its own literary canon. And of course, if in the 60s and 70s, still not so many people could read it, but at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, so many books have been published in the independent publishers. So it became part of general reading. And of course, in practice, it changed perception quite a lot. But we're speaking about critical reflection. And that what is important about this NOS Literary Prize, in the couloirs, we seem that we understand each other. But while people started speaking openly, and there are quite a lot of very renowned critics, which we invite in the jury and all these experts in a way, it's turned out that they don't have arguments to talk. That's quite a lot of, they can feel that it's great. We can feel in a way. But how you can prove that this is a really outstanding writing nowadays, the best one, or not this one? Suddenly, it's not subjective, it's an objective problem. You lack arguments because you don't have this new type of vision, this new, then this different history of literature in a way, where you can say that because of this follows that, this is succession of this, or the second-rate writing because it mimics or somehow, So the situation is that's being publishers were all right. This is the greatest hit of the year in a way, but critics can't prove it. So and if you look how old, you can watch it online. We have it on the internet. So after some time, people just started either abusing each other, saying that you don't understand anything. This is kind of argument, or somehow that's a huge and general quarrel. Instead of the argumentation, and I understand them perfectly because in the Soviet times there was some kinds of criteria when you say that's good or bad. It was sometimes politically motivated, sometimes it was really the idea that it's forbidden, that's why it's beautiful and wonderful, which is not criteria at all. But at that time, there are quite a lot of revelation. Nowadays, it's truly a problem. And that's an audience which is quarreling, saying, why didn't you choose this or that? So sometimes the audience chooses better in a way because they don't know the argument. They still feel that this or that work is very important for them. But the critics say, no, it's not a good book. And then it's a strange motivation why it's not. That's why I think what we need being that the scholars, that was the idea how to write this history of literature.
I'm actually very happy to see this list, both of them, but the latest one, because I think that these authors are not compatible in time, in space, in political views, in literary styles, in whatever. And it's like sort of like the foundation of the Soviet literature doesn't exist anymore. It's like always geology shifted, And this makes me very happy because I think that democracy is possible.
At least on the
it's developing. And lately I'm experiencing as an author a very strange thing. When I published a book in '95, which had a subtitle, Gender Lyrics, Гендерная лирика, I kind of became this feminist. And all of a sudden, like 20-something years after, it's all very solicited, I'm giving interviews and people are publishing me, and in NLO it was this feminist anthology and so forth and so forth. So it makes me very hopeful. And I don't think that we should be so much considering what was happening in the Soviet time and what was the canon or because it's not homogeneous anymore. If in America we say that, I'm just want to comment on Olga Matic, that we say that we don't have the common frame of references. Some students come and they read antique literature and this and that, and some people have no idea what is Salinger and who is whatever American classics, and it's normal because this is the readership,
The same
it
as
is,
in Russia,
yes, absolutely. So I just, I don't know what is my question, but I just wanted to share that it's like makes me happy to see that.
That's true. I just wanted to comment and say one thing that I missed. Of course, speaking about literary canon, I sound a bit old-fashioned. I don't want to, because really nowadays people read quite a lot, but quite all different things. So they don't forge their identity on the basis of the books they read, which was very important for our generation.
Sure.
But still, if you look at this Samizdat activity, it's quite a political thing in a way. That's how civil society identify itself. It's appeared and matured through this struggle for free reading. And I think it's very important for all East European countries, including Russia. So in this way, I think, just trying to write this other history of literature is a very important, it's not simply a literary thing, but still in many ways, I think, it's important for nowadays civil societies. For instance, in Russia, now that we have this new monument of Solzhenitsyn, where Putin is creating this new and very strange and very grotesque idea of the Russian writers, appropriating them and saying they was true patriot and he somehow struggled against Russophobia, something like that, which is... But it shows that still this fight for different types of canons and appreciation and appropriation of the right is still going on. Probably this is still the traditional way of the civil society, to talk and to communicate with each other. So I look at all these games in a way, in a very serious way.
Oh yeah, of course. Unlike Marina, I look at Yasha's question as very, very pertinent, actually. I think that exactly that's a question of how Tamizdat contributed to, you can call it not canon, some other word, but we have the word canon tradition. But I like canon, I'm okay with it. But my fascination with this list was that when you told us about the jury, right, and then you showed us the winners, these are the people from, the jury is the people of today looking at the text written in 1973. It's of course impossible, but wouldn't it be fascinating to see what the people in 1973, that will be a very different list. So the stocks, so to say, go up and down, the literary stock of authors, and the canon is made...
I would say in 1973, I'm afraid it was impossible to create such a list. Of course, yes.
As it is now impossible to create sociological pop.
I will actually try to answer that question because 1973 I was 18, and this is a list of my generation. And in a way, it's kind of, not all the books, but all the authors are what I read when I was 18. Plus tons of American, French, whatever I could lay my hands on. But in a way, I'm actually very happy with this list because it's very representative. And of course, it's me now looking back, many years back, but it looks like it's more or less a list, at least of the authors I would be voting then. I actually think it's possible to reconstruct what you, because I remember what I read when I was 18 pretty well. But it's a very particular strata of population. It's a Moscow intelligentsia where my father gave me to read, Ivan Denisovich when I was 13, and that's how it started. But again,
at that time, I read Mein Reed and other adventure stories.
I did too.
It depends. So I didn't know a single person from this list when I was 13, even 18, before I entered the university. So it depends.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to create all these generalizations because nowadays we can't prove anything. How many people managed to read it? How many copies were circulated through the whole country? And in this way, that's the problem for historians, who always deal with facts and figures, but we can never manage to count how many people managed to read it, or some heard about it, because there is quite a lot of talks in the kitchens where people just talked about the book. So it's an interesting way to get acquainted some new ideas through oral talking to each other and sharing experience. So in this way, I don't know how to deal with the situation, but
maybe how much
I think it's exciting. But it's exciting, yeah. But it's true, yeah.
Okay, more questions?
Maybe how much you could sell it for on the black market.
It was an interesting thing because Tamizdat and Samizdat was sellable in the Soviet Union.
How much
It
would
actually
you pay
cost
for
money.
each in the black market? That would be an interesting idea.
That you should ask people who...
Quantifiable.
Yeah.
Quantifiable.
Yeah, I remember, but it was the early 80s, again, when the Xeroxes appeared. And so I think I graduated from university, but I worked for 2 years for television, and so of course there inside quite a lot of people being. So I bought for 25 rubles Master and Margaret. 25 rubles was an enormous sum, because my salary was 120 rubles. In a way, it's awful, I still preserve it, but really, that's a disaster for the eyes, you know, because the quality was very bad. Because of course people did it at night, and all the Xeroxes, you know, still in the paper, and well.
And большая библиотека поэта, Ахматова, Пастернак, 100 rubles, which was my salary then, exactly when, and I wouldn't be able to buy it.
And this was my tips from America.
More questions?
For translating.
But I think that there is also a very particular, maybe my age show that I can tell you that it was a period also in Moscow, for example, when for hard currency you could buy, for example, pilnyak, which was not existing in any other.
You mean Berezka?
Yes, in Moscow, hard currency. So this is something which was in between. So it was a kind of a Samizdat inside Moscow. They were published by kind of official publishing houses, but they were given only for a very limited number of people with hard currency, or working in Central Committee or in some other places where they were distributed this kind of...
That's true. In which year?
So
that's why the Soviet Union has ruined, because the party members read improbable books. I would say that was a funny story, which one of the Chinese dissidents told me. He spent 10 years in prison, and then he was released by the world outcry that so many people wrote letters in a way, and now he lives in Taiwan. And he told me an absolutely amazing story. It's almost unbelievable that when China and the Soviet Union stopped being friends, they started arguing. So the Communist Party of China decided to discredit the Soviet type of communism. So they translated all the books of Russian dissidents, including Solzhenitsyn, Shalamov, and many others, and they distributed these books through the professors and students in the universities.
In Russian?
Not in Chinese. Of course, nobody could buy it in a way, but it was special distribution so that the professors and the students could read how bad the Soviet type of communism is. So he said that thanks to our party, he said, our party raised the generation of Chinese dissidents. Because the comparison between the Soviet Gulag and the Cultural Revolution in China was not a big deal for professors and students. So there are so many strange things of how enlightenment is working.
So, because we are talking about Tamizdat, we are inevitably talking about foreign geographies, right? Foreign in relation to the place where this literature comes from. To what extent do you think perhaps this canon should be shaped not only intrinsically but also via the translation choices, what gets to be translated? For example, we are grappling with this question with the Columbia University Russian Library series right now, which began as a very ambitious canon formation project, 125 editions of Russian classics in English.
I know this story from inside because I was, at least nowadays, I know whether I still is. I was one of the experts. I was invited from the Russian side to discuss this, what works must be and should be translated into English by Columbia. And funnily enough, from the Russian side usually, that was quite I would say, a traditional conservative way of presenting. This was the list of the masterpieces of the 19th century. This absolutely Soviet type of literary canon, while the people from Columbia insisted on a different vision, which is more like this list, I would say, than the other. So it was a wonderful quarrel between the parts. Of course, I supported the American view, saying, yeah, we should pay attention, we should respect different cultural contexts. But it's interesting enough, yes. That's a coexistence of different literary canons in different countries. And if we compare what is considered to be, I would say, the history of Russian literature, say, in American universities, probably they differ from one university to another, I don't know, or what is in Germany, or what is in France. It's interesting to see what types of books are translated, say, by different French publishers. I always look at the stands. You can see quite a lot of different choice, but that creates an interesting dialogue about the view on Russian literature.
And this dialogue is triggered by the simple geographical relocation of the manuscript from one place to another, which is part of what we've been talking about. But
yes,
also...
But not geographically, but aesthetical things.
Linguistic.
We heard Ellen there speaking, they had some ideas about what is good or bad and what we would like to translate. It's not physically just moved, yeah, but it was a principle of choice. It was principle of choice for every publisher, which has its own strategy. And, well, the choice of artists was wonderful, as we can see now. It's not a compliment, it's a statement.
We probably have time for one or even two more.
Everyone is exhausted, I think. Especially by these lists presented here. Yeah.
Well, please join me in welcoming Irina Prokhorova.